Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Over at my other property here in Chicago, I currently own two. The one I'm filming from right now, which will become a rental very soon, and then my former primary residence, which is a condo that I recently moved out of. Well, not quite so recently anymore, but last year I moved out of that and then started renting that out. So that's bringing in some pretty serious cash flow, all things considered, a few extra $100 per month. That is giving us some extra security in the meantime. Well, we recently had our tenants end their lease before it was originally supposed to end because they exercised a voluntary termination right that I add in there along with a buyout fee attached to that termination right. And I just want to use this as an opportunity. I want to talk about kind of how that works and how it might be a potential option for you as a landlord or just something to keep in your back pocket in case it ever is relevant. And also to emphasize the flexibility that you often have when it comes to drafting your lease as a landlord, or if you're a tenant, the negotiating leverage you might have depending on the market, depending on how hot the market is and how many other tenants are going for your unit. There's a lot of flexibility that you can build into the contract because that's what a lease is. A lease is a contract. It's the product of negotiations between two parties and each party agrees to give something to the other one. And that's what a contract is. It's an agreement to do something. In the case of a lease, it's a contract where the landlord is selling their right to the property to the tenant who is buying that right. And they now have some sort of right to use or do whatever with that property. The tenant pays money for this and the landlord should provide housing in the meantime based on the conditions in their lease and of course following any regulations and housing codes in the meantime. But getting back to my lease, it was a 12-month lease, so I was expecting the tenants to be there for at least 12 months and ideally we would have been able to renew at some point. Well, my tenants ended up buying a condo, which is good for them. So they decided they were going to move out of this unit and they ended up exercising their voluntary termination right that I included in the lease, which came with a buyout fee equivalent to 1 month's rent. So they effectively had to pay their final month's rent when they were terminating and then an additional sort of month's rent, although it was really a fee that was the same as a month's rent, as a sort of way to cover the turn costs with ending this lease early because it was priced as though it was going to be a 12-month lease. If I was doing a month-to-month lease, I'd have a higher monthly rent because both sides have more flexibility to end it, and the tenant in particular has more flexibility to end it. So as a landlord, in many cases, you have a bit more risk in that situation because a tenant can move out, and then if they damage it at all, you're going to have to fix it. And then the next person that comes in can then start renting it. So you have some delay there. There's turn costs whenever someone moves out of the unit. That's something you always want to try to avoid as a landlord, is having someone move out of the unit. Because whenever someone moves out, not only do you have the actual physical maintenance cost of touching everything up, if anything was damaged on move out, of course, or even before move out, you're going in and fixing anything that the other tenant might have done, or if there's any wear and tear, you're trying to bring things back up to standard. But you also have to spend time renting the unit. Maybe you're paying a property manager or a leasing agent. They're going to take often 1 month's rent or half month's rent at least. So that's expensive. There are just a lot of turn costs associated with switching out tenants. So it's pretty expensive to have lots of different tenants coming in and out. So that's why a month-to-month lease, typically you're going to see a higher monthly rental amount because the landlord's trying to mitigate that risk. The big expense there is the turn costs associated with getting a new tenant in there. All this to say is I think it's fair that if I'm pricing something as though it's a 12-month lease and someone wants to terminate it early, I do want them to have that option because I don't want them to be miserable in the unit, but I do want some compensation to cover the effective turn costs by them sort of throwing off the schedule, I suppose, in that I'm expecting them to take 12 months to possibly get out of the lease or get out of the unit if they don't renew. But instead, in this case, they ended up terminating quite a few months early. But because of that buyout fee, I now have some extra money that can be used to effectively turn the unit, and it's like I never missed a beat. That whole buyout premise is something I picked up working at a large multifamily development during my college years. They had that in all of their leases, a buyout right, and actually made some pretty significant income through the year from that buyout right. A lot of people would exercise it because they often were kind of in that price point where it might have made sense to buy a home, but instead they were renting. So if they ended up buying a home, it's kind of hard to figure out when exactly you're going to buy that because, you know, there's only so much inventory. And if you find the home that you like, you'd hate to say, I can't buy it for a few months because my lease isn't going to expire till then. But because they had the termination right, it made a lot more sense to just pay that extra fee and then you're out of the lease and then you can go buy your house or do whatever, which is effectively what happened in my case too. So it's definitely something I'm going to continue to offer in the future because it just adds a layer of flexibility for kind of both sides in that if someone wants to get out of the lease, they still can, got to pay a fee. And then that fee that I would receive as a landlord can then be used to turn the unit and get it back rented and in shape. And if I decide I don't want to do that anymore, then I don't have to. And that's the great thing about being a landlord or just contract negotiations in general. You have some flexibility. When you have leverage, when you have a unit that people want, you can add clauses into that lease and add things that make sense. And they don't have to be all one-sided in favor of the landlord, because ideally you're offering something in exchange to the tenant, especially if you're trying to sort of improve the market value of that unit. If you can offer some nice things in your lease that the tenant would value, then more power to you. But of course, you don't want to get overzealous with this, because there's a risk to offering anything, because anything that you offer is something that someone could take and potentially take advantage of if you offer a little bit too much and you don't mitigate that sort of risk. All I'm saying is just be careful when drafting your lease. And if you have no idea what you're doing, then don't draft it yourself. You can often just use a form in your given jurisdiction, because again, every town, every city often has their own rental laws, their own lease laws, and you might not be able to include that super aggressive anti-tenant clause that you might think you can add, because oftentimes there are a lot of regulations that totally supersede whatever might be in your lease. So you got to be careful there. Definitely worth talking with a landlord-tenant attorney in your area if you need help drafting your lease, or if you have questions about lease laws, because again, it can get very complicated and it's often quite different between different towns and jurisdictions. But even then, you still often have quite a bit of flexibility in how you structure your leases and the different clauses you can offer. Because ultimately, as a landlord, you are running a business. You are offering space, you're offering that right to the property, and you can change what that right looks like based on what you include in the lease. Is it month to month? Do you have that termination right? Do you have some sort of specific space in the house or in the apartment building, whatever it is, that tenants may or may not be able to use? Do you offer them the ability to have pets? And seemingly countless other features you could include in a lease and you could offer to a prospective tenant. Or I really should say prospective customers, because that's what tenants really are. They are your customers, and you want to make sure that they're satisfied, while of course protecting your own interests and making sure that you're protecting that bottom line as much as you can, because no one's in this business to lose a bunch of money. That wouldn't last for a very long time. But the only way you're really going to make money, at least over the long term, is by protecting your reputation, of course, and making sure that you're treating tenants right. You're not being predatory in your leases. I'm not suggesting that by any means. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. And it really depends kind of what the market is doing and whether whatever you're offering actually makes sense and would be beneficial to either you or the tenant. And on the flip side, as a tenant, you have the opportunity to ask for some of these things. Of course, with more corporate landlords, it's probably going to be very unlikely you're going to be able to include any sort of custom clauses, but maybe you can ask for some concessions. Maybe you get a pet fee waived. Maybe you get free parking if you're in a bigger building or something like that. Especially with independent landlords, you can often work in sort of clauses like this. Maybe you're on a temporary sort of employment thing where you're planning on moving soon and you want to make that clear to the landlord. Hey, I'll pay some extra rent in exchange for the ability to terminate after a few months or something like that. You can always try to work those sort of negotiation terms in, just of course know who you're dealing with. And likewise, get professional help if you need it. But anyways, ideally this was at least a little valuable. It's something that just happened in my portfolio, and potentially you could incorporate it into your own, or if you're not a landlord and you're a tenant, it's something you can keep an eye out for as well. Whatever the case, like, comment, subscribe, all that great stuff. And until next time, take care.